Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Sea Life in Nelson's Time by John Masefield. Chapter 8.
The day of a man-of-war's man began at midnight, or at 4 in the morning, according to the alternation of the watches. If he had the middle watch, from 12 p.m. till 4 a.m., he came on deck at midnight and remained there till 4 a.m., doing any duty which appeared necessary. The work at night in fine weather was easy. The men had but to trim the sails and be ready for a call. The boatswain's mates, with a midshipman or two, kept watch on the forecastle. Lookouts were placed in the tops and crosstrees. The sentries, helmsman, officer of the watch, midshipmen, and master's mates went to their posts on the poop and quarterdeck. The remainder of the watch were supposed by the Articles of War to keep awake on pain of death. Some captains and lieutenants allowed those not actually on watch as lookout men to sleep during their night watches if the weather was very fine. The act of sleeping during a night watch in the tropics was known as taking a caulk, because by lying on the plank seams, the sailors' jackets were marked with lines of tar. In those ships aboard which the sailors were expected to keep awake, the boatswain's mates walked round with their starters or kept buckets of water ready to wake anyone who fell asleep. In wet weather, there was no sleeping in any ship during the night watch on deck, because the men were put to collecting rainwater for washing clothes. In foul weather, they were too busily employed in other ways. A few minutes before 8 bells, or 4 a.m., the quartermasters stole down the after ladders to call the midshipmen, mates, and lieutenant of the other watch. The boatswain's mates took their pipes to the fore and main hatchways, and blew the prolonged, shrill call, "All hands," following it up by a shout of "Starboard or larboard, watch ahoy!" "Rouse out there, you sleepers! Hey, out or down here!" At this order, the watch below, who were snugly sleeping in their hammocks, turned out at once, without waiting till they were properly awake. When they had turned out, they put on their clothes, if they had taken them off, and bustled up on deck with the starters after them. At 8 bells they were mustered and sent to their stations. The wheel and lookouts were relieved. The log was hove and the rate of sailing marked on the board. The men of the other watch, who had kept the deck since midnight, were then allowed to go below to their hammocks. Shortly after 4 o'clock, the idlers were called up. The cook lit his fires in the galley and began to boil the abominable burgoo for breakfast. The carpenter and carpenter's mates came on deck and began their work. The boatswain came up, and the watch on deck began active duty. Before 5 a.m., the watch took off their shoes and stockings, rolled up their trousers to the thigh, rigged the pumps, got out the scrubbers and buckets, and began to wash her down. First of all, the decks were wetted by means of the head pump and buckets. After the bucket men came a couple of hands sprinkling sand on the wetted planks. When the sand had been sprinkled, the main body of the seamen took their holystones and went upon their hands and knees to whiten the deck to its usual spotless whiteness. The gangways and main deck could be holystoned by a large stone, a block of holystone weighing many pounds with rings at each end. The sailors rove ropes through the rings and ran the block to and fro on the wet and sanded planking. All the out-of-the-way places, under guns, carronade slides, bits, etc., were scrubbed by the handstones, or prayer books. It was hard and often unpleasant work, scrubbing the decks in all weathers, some 14 hours after the last meal. The upper and main decks were thus whitened every morning. It was a real hardship to kneel for an hour or two on sanded planks in frosty Channel weather. Many sailors developed sore knees from the practice. After the holystoners came the broom and bucket men, who swilled and swept the dirty sand into the waterways and so overboard through the scuppers. After these came the swabbers, who flogged the damp decks with swabs till they had dried them. The little brasswork about the rails and bits was then brightened. The ropes were coiled, flaked, or Flemished down, and the wash-deck gear of holystones, buckets, and brooms was returned to the lockers and hooks. By 7 o'clock, the work was practically finished, and the decks nearly dry. The first lieutenant came on deck at about this time to begin his long day's supervision. At about 7:30, the boatswain's mates went below to the berth deck and piped, All hands, up hammocks, a pipe which brought up the sleepers and filled the decks with scurrying figures carrying their lashed-up hammocks to the nettings, where they were stowed in order by the quartermasters and midshipmen. By 8 a.m., the captain had come on deck. The last of the hammocks had been stowed, the mess tables had been lowered into position between the guns, and the cook had wreaked his worst upon the burgoo, or Scotch coffee. At a word from the captain, the boatswain piped to breakfast. 8 bells was struck upon the ship's bell, and nearly every man except the helmsman, lookout men, and officers on duty slipped down to breakfast. Half an hour was allowed for this meal on weekdays. At 8:30, the watch was called, and those who had slept from 4 till 7:30 a.m. came upon deck, bringing with them the bags and chests from the berths. These were stowed on the booms, while the lower deck was cleaned by the watch below with the dry holystone and sand. The lower deck was never washed down with water, save in fine, dry weather, when the ports could be opened, and port fires burned to dry the wet planking. At other times it was sanded, scraped and holystoned, then swept with dry brooms and perhaps swabbed over. The lower deck beams were often sponged over with vinegar as a disinfectant. The cooks of the different messes passed the forenoon watch in cooking in the galley, cleaning up the mess utensils, and getting dinner ready. Those who had the watch below were often free to do as they wished. They could sleep or yarn or mend their clothes. Their hammocks were stowed in the nettings, but if lucky they could sleep in between the guns on the bare deck, provided the space was not wanted by one of the ship's artificers, such as the carpenter. Those who had the watch on deck were employed in the work of the ship, in the rigging, or about the guns, doing the never-finished duties of sailormen. Some captains preferred to send their watch below to exercise at the guns directly they had cleaned the lower deck. At 6 bells, or 11 o'clock, the captain, who had finished breakfast, seen the young gentleman's logs, examined the boatswain's, purser's, and carpenter's accounts, and had a talk with the first lieutenant, came on deck with the black list, and called all hands to witness punishment. The master-at-arms brought up his men in irons from the bilboes under the half-deck. The gratings were rigged, the hands mustered, and the poor fellows flogged according to the captain's pleasure and the articles of war. By the time the execution had been done and the blood swabbed up, it was time to take the sun's altitude. The master, master's mates, and midshipmen brought out their sextants and quadrants. Noon was reported when the sun reached the meridian. The clock was put back or put forward. 8 bells was struck. The boatswain's mate piped his long, cheery pipe to dinner. All hands ran below with a song, and then began the pleasantest part of the day. Dinner generally took about half an hour, from 12 till 1:30. It was a merry meal, eaten cheerily, with a great buzz of talk all along the gun deck. At 12:30 there came a great clink of cans and banging of tin plates on the tables. The fifer took his flute to the main or upper deck, where the master's mate stood by the tub to dispense sea ambrosia to the ship's company. At the sound of one bell, the fifer struck up Nancy Dawson, or some other lively tune, such as Drops of Brandy, and immediately the ship's company took up the tune. The mess cooks seized their blackjacks and hurried to the tub where the grog was served out. They then carried it below to the messes, where it was drunken down, with many songs and toasts. The debts were discharged, bets settled, and purchases effected. Grog time was the one happy hour of the day. With grog and an occasional battle, a sailor was often almost contented. At 1:30, when the last oozings of the blackjack had been drained, the watch on deck was called to duty. The watch below were sometimes allowed to keep below, to sleep if they could, or to amuse themselves as they pleased, as soon as they had swept away the crumbs of dinner. More frequently, they were called on deck with the rest to be drilled into smartness. Topsails were reefed, and upper spars sent down. The ship was tacked and wore. The fire bell was rung. The men were sent to stations for letting go anchor. Landsmen and raw hands were taken below by the gunner's mates and trained at the heavy guns. Other squads were drilled in the use of the musket or cutlass. Boarding parties were stationed at their respective guns and suddenly called away when they were expected to snatch up pistols, cutlasses, and boarding pikes and to run on deck to hack the air furiously beside the hammock nettings. Some captains who drilled the crew thus allowed their complements to take an occasional afternoon watch below, especially in heavy weather. Once or twice on each cruise, they turned them up in the afternoon to dance and skylark, with the ship's fiddler to play their dance tunes. At 4 p.m., the boatswain piped to supper, which lasted half an hour, and was made pleasant by the second serving out of grog. Shortly after supper, but before sunset, the drummer beat to quarters. All hands had to repair to their stations. The guns were cast loose. The midshipmen and lieutenants had to make a minute inspection of the men and gun gear. The pumps were rigged, the life buoys were placed in position, and the ship reported to the captain as being in good order. It was at this evening muster that the master-at-arms made most of his arrests. Many poor fellows, who had saved up their dinner grog and taken a long swig at the halyards before quarters, were then put in irons for the next day's blacklist. A little thickness or gaiety in the voice, or a little unsteadiness in the walk, was always inquired into. He was a happy sailor who had the first watch below, and a head so strong that nothing showed till a couple of hours after taking. When the company had finished their exercise and secured the guns for the night, it was time for the hammocks to be piped down. The men ran on deck, received their hammocks from the nettings, slung them in their places, and then stood by till 8 bells. At 8 o'clock, the first night watch was called and set, and the watch below went down to their hammocks until midnight. The lights were extinguished or covered over, so that they would not show from a distance. The master-at-arms, or ship's corporals, began their policemen's rounds. The first lieutenant turned in for the night. Quiet settled down upon the ship to be broken only by the creaking of the tiller ropes, the padding of the reef points, and the occasional "all's well" cry of the sentries, showing that they had not fallen asleep. The watch and watch system, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, with the 4 hours off constantly broken in upon by the ship's routine, was severe and harassing. It meant that the sailor had but 4 hours of sleep one night, and a bare 7 hours the night following. The little naps they managed to take in the forenoons and afternoons were hardly worth mentioning. They were too uncertain, too liable to interruption. Even in their watches below at night, they were liable to be called on deck to tack, to wear, to shorten sail, or to go to their stations. Once a month, at least, they were drummed up to general quarters in the middle of their dreams. Every Thursday, the hammocks were called up at 4 a.m., and the morning watch was passed by the men in washing clothes. Every Monday, the day watches were fully occupied by gun drill, target practice, and musket exercise. Every Thursday afternoon, all hands were sent to mend their clothes. They were at all times liable to be called upon for works of supererogation, such as sweeping or coiling down. On Saturdays, the men slung clean hammocks. They passed the afternoon in holystoning the decks, ready for Sunday, as the daily routine on Sunday was always rather lighter than on weekdays. The Saturday cleaning made it unnecessary to holystone the decks on Sunday morning. The men merely sprinkled the planks and swabbed them down, instead of scrubbing them. The hammocks were piped up half an hour earlier than usual and stowed with more than usual care, numbers out, so that the clean white cloths made a brave show all down the nettings. Breakfast was piped half an hour earlier than usual, so that the forenoon watch should be long enough both for divisions and divine service. While breakfast was in progress, the boatswain's mates passed the word for the company to shave and put on clean shirts before coming on deck for morning muster. After breakfast, the bags were carried on deck, and the gun decks were swiftly dry holystoned and carefully swept by the ship's sweepers. Every scrap of dust and dirt was removed. The rags and brick dust for the polishing of the little bright work in the ships were brought out, and used till the brass and steel were shining like gold. The cook polished his coppers. The armorer put a shine upon his cutlasses, muskets, and pistols. The cooper got his casks in order. The boatswain, sailmaker, carpenter, and purser saw to the ordering of their respective storerooms. The quarter-gunners made the round of their guns, and in fine weather traversed them, in order to clean the plank covered by the carriages, and to remove any shakings or mess clouts stowed beneath them by idle sweepers. The gunner down in the magazine saw that the seacocks which flooded the magazine in case of fire were ready for use, that the right proportion of cartridges was filled, and that the bands of the copper-bound powder casks were polished with a little soft rag. Every petty officer and man aboard was busy polishing, cleaning, and arranging. The time for preparation was limited. Much had to be done, yet 2 hours and a half at most was the time allowed for the duty. Before 10:30, the men contrived to shave and shift themselves, using the head and forecastle and the berths between the guns for their toilet rooms. The barbers plied their business in the head, while all about the forward parts of the ship one might have seen the old sailors, sitting on inverted mess kids, having their queues dressed by their mates. Others feverishly mended their shirts and trousers, curled their ringlets, cleaned their shoes, or shaved their 3-day beards. A few minutes before 10:30, the sweepers again took their brooms over the speckless decks, while the first lieutenant made a hurried examination of the whole ship to see that nothing was amiss. Then, at 10:30, the bell struck, and the drummer took his drum and beat to muster. The men, in their clean blue trousers and white shirts, or clean white trousers and blue shirts, fell in on the gangways, main deck, and quarterdeck. The ship's boys fell in on the forecastle. When they had all fallen in with their toes on an indicated seam or line of tar, the midshipmen called them over. The lieutenants then inspected them to send down any man improperly or dirtily dressed. The surgeon took the opportunity to examine the men for traces of scurvy. After these preliminary examinations, the captain came round to inspect the men and to receive the reports of the junior officers. The captain then examined every part of the ship, from the forecastle to the lower hold. He was accompanied on his rounds by the first lieutenant, to whom he made any necessary complaint. The lower parts of the ship were lighted up during the inspection by the petty and warrant officers in charge of them. It was the custom of many officers to wear a white glove while going round the ship, so that a light touch inside a cook's copper or on a beam would betray the presence of any dirt or dust. As soon as the inspection had come to an end, the sailors were released from the misery of towing the deck seam and driven aft to divine service, which was held on the quarter-deck in the open air. They sat on buckets and mess kids and on inverted match tubs, or on the slides of the after carronades. A bell was tolled to call them aft, and a church pendant was hoisted at the peak as soon as they were in their places. The chaplain then came forward to the after hatchway gratings and read the prayers prescribed by the liturgy, afterwards giving a short address. If there were no chaplain, the captain was expected to officiate, but the captains generally got out of the difficulty by reading the Articles of War. After church, the men were piped to dinner. They were then free, as far as the work of the ship allowed it, to do as they wished till supper time at 4 or 4:30. The free Sunday afternoons were passed in rest and quietness on the various decks. The watch on deck slept on the forecastle, or walked to and fro on the gangways, or spun their yarns between the forward carronades. The watch below generally kept on the lower deck, or on one side of the main deck, the other being reserved for a promenade for the lieutenants. They formed into little parties between the guns, at the mess tables, where they yarned or read, or played checkers draughts for the entire afternoon. Some slept on the deck, with a rolled-up coat for a pillow. Others stole away to some quiet nook, where they could rattle the bones, using their tarry fists for dice boxes. Cards and dice were forbidden, but the ships were manned so indiscriminately that every complement contained card-sharpers, gamblers, and professional rooks. These men indulged in their favorite games, keeping a smart lookout for the master-at-arms and ship's corporal. In port and in the fleets at sea, it was the custom to allow ship visiting on Sunday afternoons if the weather were fine. The sailors were not allowed to go ashore, save in exceptional circumstances. But to make amends for this restriction, they were allowed to visit the other ships of war in company. The boats were kept busy all the afternoon conveying the Liberty men from one ship to the other. It seems that the ships vied with each other in hospitality, many of the men being well content to give up half their Sunday grog if, by doing so, they might make their visitors drunk. Ship visiting was subversive of all good discipline, though in conception it was humane and kindly meant. The men often got very drunk and often quarreled with their hosts. If they agreed with their hosts, they returned to their own ships discontented and eager to find fault with their officers and shipmates. After supper on Sundays, the weekly muster was held, at which the men had to pass one by one before the captain to answer to their names. After muster, when the drunken men had been secured, the drummer beat to quarters. The guns were examined and pronounced to be fit for action. The hammocks were piped down, and the first watch was set. After the setting of the watch, the day was accounted over. The lights were extinguished, and the watch below turned in. The ordinary routine of the ship was again imposed upon all hands.
This concludes today's reading of Sea Life in Nelson's Time, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.